community.
sponsor, Tecnoglass, for supporting this event. In this last lecture, we are actually doing something quite exciting. So including myself, we have 4 faculty from the School of Architecture to talk about the relationship between architecture and plants through the research and practice work they have done in South Miami. So as you guys have heard me saying this in the past few lectures, in this lecture series we are exploring how plants or vegetal life relate to alternative methods of designing and building, how it will shift assumptions about permanence and expertise in architecture and landscape productions, and also how the act of planting can also empower people. We have, including myself, 4 faculty joining us tonight. And so what we're going to do is we will have 4 presentations, starting with Dean el-Khoury, and then Professor Shawna, Meyer, and then Professor Rocco, and then myself. And after each of our presentation, we will have a panel discussion, and you guys are obviously welcome to join us and talk more about teaching and other work being done at the school. So I'm going to start by introducing Dean el-Khoury. Rodolphe el-Khoury is the Dean of the University of Miami School of Architecture. Trained as both a historian and a designer, he divides his time between scholarship, research, and practice. He is the author of numerous books on architecture and urbanism, including See Through Ledoux, Architecture Theater, and the Pursuit of Transparency, Monolithic Architecture, and Figures, Essays on Contemporary Architecture. Dean el-Khoury leads Red Lab, a research unit dedicated to embedded technology and robotics aiming at enhancing responsiveness and resilience in building and smart cities. The work of his firm, Khoury Livid Farm, has won international awards. His work has been featured in national and international media outlets that cut across disciplines ranging from Wired magazine to Wall Street Journal to the Space Channel to the BBC World. He has shared his work through teaching, visiting professorships, and lectures at dozens of institutions in the US and abroad. Shawna Meyer is a founding principal of Atelier A, an architecture practice based in Miami, and a faculty member at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Shawna's design methodology explores a multifaceted approach that recognizes the significance of economic, social, cultural, and environmental factors, integrating them as enhancements rather than compromises within her work in practice, teaching, and research. As principal of Atelier May, Shawna received a 2021 AIA Honor Award for Sustainable Architects of the Year from Miami AIA, while her firm was named AIA Miami Small Firm of the Year in 2022. The firm's work is presently included in the exhibition, a South 40 exhibition at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as it is going to be included in the 2025 American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale exhibition. So lastly, let me also introduce Professor Rocco. He's a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture, where he teaches courses in design, design build, foundation, and advanced courses in drawing, and seminars on color theory, Michelangelo, Historic Association of Building Surveys, and Historic Association of Landscape Survey. As an architect and artist, he has produced drawings of the elements of Florida's landscapes, as well as the documentation of seminal sites in the history of South Florida. Sites such as Vizcaya, Corvo Castle, and the Majority Stoneman Douglas home. His published work includes the award-winning books Redland, A Preservation and Tourism Plan, done with Margot Amidon and Maria Nardi, and Historic Landscapes of Florida, co-authored with Professor Joanna Lombard. His architecture practice focuses on the unique relationship between architecture and landscape found in the American tropics. His work has received awards from the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, Progressive Architecture, and ID Magazine. His most recent projects include the B. and W.R. Miller Build Lab for the University of Miami School of Architecture Design Build program that he co-founded and co-directs with Jim Adamson, and Building Eden, the beginning of Miami-Dade County's visionary park system, co-authored with Joanna Lombard and Stephen Brooke. I feel like you guys all know all three professors already, so I hope through seeing their work tonight, you get to know what they have been working on and their research agendas, and I welcome you to ask any questions at the end when we have a panel discussion. So I know you guys are...
Introduce yourself.
Yes, in case you don't know who I am, my name is Wong. I'm the newish assistant professor at the School of Architecture here, and I'm the person who organized this semester's lecture series because I'm really interested in vegetal life, and my research focuses on the relationship between architecture and plants, not only as greenhouses or building types, but also thinking about plants as subjects, as building material, and also different ways to use plants for community engagement. So without further ado, I ask that you join us and welcome Dean el-Khoury.
Thank you, Lily, for putting this together. Not only this session, but the entire series, which was really remarkable, and we appreciate your work. So I took your assignment seriously, and I'm showing a family of portraits which is very literally related to the theme. The work was produced at the Rad Lab that Lily mentioned, the Rad Lab, but the one also I co-directed at the University of Toronto before I came here. And in that incarnation, the work also overlapped with my professional practice. Rad Lab served as a consultant of sorts for the technology technology aspects of the practice. So the family of project, its genealogy goes back to one particular competition entry. This was for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Shenzhen in 2007. And it was an open competition. We advanced to the second stage, where they retained only 4 architects, including Co-op Himmelblau, who won the competition. And my partners blame me for not winning because I insisted on integrating, when we developed the project for the second stage, I insisted on integrating these algae bioreactors in the envelope. These are tubular tanks that contain algae cultures that produce biofuel to offset the energy bill of the building. They sequester CO2, detoxify the air, remediate gray water for the irrigation and cooling of the surrounding open spaces. This is now, we've seen this actually implemented in various iterations, but that was the first time it was completely unprecedented at that point, and it generated this curiosity about the possibility of integrating living organic matter into the material of the building. Also, I want to mention that although those environmental aspects were very important drivers, they were not the sole motivation. There is a surplus that we saw, which has to do with the experiential, phenomenal aspects of the building, which cannot be completely accounted for by the environmental performance of the building. So the family has 2 branches. One where we incorporate that living organism into the building by means and control it with information technology, advanced microprocessors and computational design. But also there's another branch which is really the opposite, which is about imitating nature by mechanical means. So you see on the right a kind of robotic flower, which was designed. This is a prototype designed for the outdoor deployment, and it functions basically like a flower. It's a solar-powered scent diffuser. So I will focus on the former, the integration of the organism in the building, but just a few slides about the latter. This is like an artificial tree that was commissioned for the Chengdu biennial, made of fiber optics, and these are the tubes have essential oil imitating green apples, basically, and it has motion sensors, and the fiber optics are all gathered below, fitted with a laser, so actually they can light up and have this amazing light show, but only if there is no movement at all around them. So at night, when there's nobody there, it goes wild. But when there are people around, there's nothing, it's quiet. So people have to stop moving for the light to begin animating the tree. It's counterintuitive, but actually this is how, in nature, this is what happens when you enter into a natural environment. You interrupt it with your presence, and then it comes alive when you leave it. This is a garden commissioned for the World Expo in Chishan, where we deployed that artificial flower. These are light poles which doubled as scent diffusers that overlapped an olfactory, computer-controlled, very precisely curated olfactory landscape over the garden. pieces. So at night you can see, visualize in the intensification of the light. Because when that wind turbine starts to rotate more rapidly, the light intensifies. You can see a visualization of the diffusion of that descents across the garden. So there were several of these projects, and we got so invested in curating these olfactory experiences that we became more invested in scent or the smell as a new frontier for design. I think really there's still a lot to do with scent. It had been neglected because we didn't have the technology to shape it and control it precisely as a design object, but now we can. One last project in that branch, the synthesizer, which is a device actually that allowed you to design and perform olfactory experiences. You have a number of primary ingredients used in perfumery, and you can arrange them using a graphic user interface. Anyone of you who has used one of those music sequencing platforms is familiar with how you can compose music like this, and it's the same for this device that heats the scented oils and then can diffuse the scents according to the composition. Okay, so now back to the integration of the plants in the building. I have two projects that I want to show in detail. The first belongs to this period where we were interested in suspending plants upside down. Why? Because there was this very popular NASA study that was circulated then that demonstrated that some plants actually thrive when they are upside down, like tomatoes, for instance, that's the most common one, and many others. So we were intrigued because and that was the period when green walls were all the rage. But we thought, hey, maybe the ceiling is a better site for this kind of deployment of greenery, because it's an underutilized real estate, right? We use the wall for many things, but the ceiling is underutilized. So this triggered a number of projects, including this crazy project for the design the boardroom of a tech startup in Toronto, but which led nowhere. But finally was kind of encapsulated or crystallized in this product, which we prototyped and we wanted to develop for, mass markets. Imagine this being actually like Home Depot or other big box retail outlets. So basically, it's a substitute or an alternative to your typical acoustical tiles, same dimension. It is designed to fit exactly in those existing ubiquitous drop ceilings. And you can buy one or several, you can aggregate them to create larger fields, but it could be only one. And it consists of a shell. This is the one that will be dropped in that suspended ceiling. It has integrated sensors for temperature, humidity, and light, and an LCD display, and wireless connectivity. I'll explain why. And within that shell, you have these cartridges that you also buy at the Home Depot. They come in rolls, like toilet paper. You unroll and tear off along the dotted line. Your mouse cartridge, which comes in different colors and shapes. And like I said, it has wireless connectivity. It uploads the data to a cloud server. It's correlated, and the tile and the system has the capacity to optimize the health of the mouse by imitating the parameters or the conditions where the moth has thrived in the data that it has correlated. Also, garden. Basically use something like this to just spray the tile once in a while. Actually, it sends you a message when the sensor detects that it's too dry, alerts you that it needs a little bit of spray. And because the substrate, which is made of coconut shells, is imbued with this chemical, geosmin. You smell this molecule after the rain. It's released by the roots of the vegetation around you. And you know what I'm talking about, you will recognize it. This is what rain smells like. It's actually geosmin. And it's supposed to have an antidepressant effect. You can guess why, because maybe at the primordial state it is connected in our brains to fertility, right? You know, the rain is going to bring crops. Anyway, so we were doing so many of these olfactory projects that we were invited to participate in an exhibition on designer sense, and our contribution was New Jersey Turnpike, which was geosmin mixed with asphalt, rubber, and gasoline. And actually it smelled pretty good. Okay, the second project, this is Rhode, Miami, was commissioned by the Museum of Science, the Frost Museum of Science, before they had the big budget problem. It's basically they wanted to animate one of those, the blank facade, which is still blank. They felt that it needed something, so we proposed this project for the envelope and also a way to animate the terrace facing it. Basically, it goes back to that Chishan project. Instead of the tubes, we have an array of algae tanks which perform the same environmental functions, purify or remediate the gray water, but also, like I mentioned in the Shenzhen one, they also scrub the air because the HVAC exhaust feeds into these tanks to basically feed the algae with the CO2. But what we do is control precisely how much air, dirty air, goes into each tank. And basically, this way we can vary how fast the algae grows in each discrete tank. So we can actually have the tanks perform as pixels by varying the growth rate and the density of the algae in each tank. We can produce this image basically in one day with that calibration of the CO2 coming into the tank. So that you can produce any image. The former provost called this the slowest developing Polaroid. It takes one day. But we propose to use it to actually visualize data that has to do with smart city functions, like in this case, the consumption of water in the different neighborhoods of Miami, to make a spectacle out of something, the data that is not necessarily known, or the forces that shape the city that remain invisible. And you can access these from a dedicated app. Also, you don't have to be on the site. Most importantly, it creates an interesting environment and a spectacle by means of these environmentally driven projects. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Lily, for inviting me to be here this evening. As stated, I am Shawna Meyer. I am a professor here, and also this evening I'm talking about some of the work that my practice at UMSoA does. This is the core group of us. Been around for about 5 years, but we love to hire students, and we sort of ebb and flow between 5 587 people. So we're based here in Miami, and we're really interested in engaging architecture and building through a more rigorous understanding of ecology, environment, cultural and social aspects that influence how we build and why we build. So I arrived to Miami about 6.5, almost 7 years ago now. I really didn't know much about Florida or southern Florida, but knew architecture and knew that I wanted to make. And so looking around, there aren't a lot of trees, or trees that we build with. Okay, that thing's flashing. I thought this is okay. But if we actually look around in the rest of our state, we are part of what's known as the wood basket in the United States. So the southeast states create that, and this is a lot of what northern Florida looks like. In Florida, as a state and a region, we are covered with more than 50% of trees. So if we go just a few hours north, and if we think a little bit broader about what a regional language is and a regional material supply, this is what it has to offer. Southern yellow pine, I also learned, is not really a name of anything, but a name of a group of different types of pine trees that grow quite well in our region. So loblolly pine, longleaf pine, and slash pine. And I thought it was really interesting, the title of this series, this architecture series, Vegetable Life, because while yes, we think about wood as a renewable resource, as something that grows, and it's very much vegetation. You know, when we deploy it, it has already been cut, and we don't actually think about it as plants so much. So it was really interesting thinking through how to talk about the work, and I think it's very fair to say that we've always thought about and tried to engage the forest through its own language, through its own set of parameters. And I'm going to talk about, very briefly, two projects, or really just one project, but I wanted to introduce the first project that got us there. So we're looking around, we understand southern yellow pine. This, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you buy a 2x4, if it's American, it's probably southern yellow pine in our region. Believe it or not, we're importing a lot of it from other countries, but you guys all have probably seen this wood. It grows fast, it can be harvested within 20 years, and it's quite structural. So across our country in the last decade, a new building methodology has been emerging. That is tiled mass timber building. And so around the time that we arrived in Miami and at the University of Miami, at the same time, this new building methodology was deploying in the southeast. So in 2019, the very first manufacturer to make mass timber or crafts-laminated timber, also known as CLT, out of southern yellow pine, I know that's a lot of words, just opens its doors in 2019. So in terms of thinking about an emerging building material, a new material language, and a way of thinking through making and building, this was quite exciting for us. My partner, Chris Meyer, who you guys all lovingly know as the other Professor Meyer. And so one of our first projects, other than building a knowledge network across the nation and trying to start teaching about building with wood and what mass timber building could mean here within our school and with you guys as students, we designed and built this case study house that really tested what does it mean to work with this material, to prefabricate, to engage in policymakers in our local community. This was the first mass timber project in Miami-Dade County. So when you're the first of anything and you're trying to do it in Miami-Dade, where it's already very hard and restrictive, it took a lot of conversations. It took a lot of us really learning what it was we were trying to do and being confident in how we were going to do it before we did it, which sometimes we like to learn as we go. But along this path, we've learned a lot about it. Again, I mentioned it's a renewable resource. It's harvested from all the trees that I just shared. The other thing that became really important was what does it mean to design in Miami, which is a hot and humid climate. So how do we design not just looking at the structure, which is the walls and the roof that you're seeing here are wood, but what is that full building assembly? How does that exist in a hot and humid climate? What is the material science? What are vapor barriers? What are rain screens? What are all of those components of architecture that are emerging and developing over the last decades with this new building material? And then there's also the carbon story. So we've taken a lot of time to invest in understanding what does it mean, what are trees' relationships with carbon, what does it mean to harvest the trees, to truck it or ship it to where it's going, and what is a true carbon agenda. I won't get into all of those this evening, but if anybody wants to ask me some other time, I'd love to talk about it. So the project that I want to share tonight is called Mass Haptic, and what we're looking at here again is an image of a southern yellow pine forest. This happens to be in Gainesville, Florida, at the Austin-Cary Forest, which is an extension of the University of Florida's campus and their School of Forestry, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. And we're working with the school in a capacity to help build or to plan for a new building that would be out of mass timber. And out of this project, we also designed and built this pavilion that's meant to be a living lab. And it's meant to understand languages of craft and connect people that will be in the pavilion back to the space and place that the material came from. So again, we're looking into the forest and we're looking into the structure and to start to understand the space of the pavilion that we're interested in making. Within our office, you guys saw Haley in the picture. I'm going to give her a shout out. I think she's here tonight. We started to think about all the lessons we learned in collaborating with the foresters and what are planting densities. Again, these things are studied just like architecture. They've developed through the decades. They become more dense, they become less dense. They are genetics and science is a huge part of it. But about 1 acre, they're looking at 500 or 650 density. And so we began to study what does that look like, what is the row spacing, and then there's natural decay, right? So some things die, and then even in the harvesting process, they would actually begin to remove rows. But what we did was, working with Rhino and Grasshopper, come up with a series of studies that says, what does this decay and what does this spatial language start to look like of the forest? And then we interpreted that to understand what it could be at the scale of the pavilion, about 20 feet by 20 feet. And so we came here and we translated that row cropping and that density to this grid, and we also brought over the decay language and started to develop spaces within the space. And we took a little bit of artist liberty here, creator liberty, and did a push and pull attractor. And so where decay was already starting to make small spaces or big spaces, we began to amplify those, and we were studying these space and plan until we felt like we came up with a room that had different size rooms within it, so someone could be alone, a small group could gather, different activities could happen. And so that what you're seeing here on the right is the end result. So the first we established the grid, the plantings on the grid, we introduced the decay, we started grouping the decay as I was talking about, and then we even further pushed and pulled what some of these columns or logs would look like in the real world. Everything doesn't grow straight, they're different sizes, they contribute differently to the space and structurally. And so once we had our design, or that idea, we began to think about it three-dimensionally, how it would touch the ground, knowing that our team was going to be in charge of building this, knowing that our budget was incredibly limited, also knowing that it was on UF's campus, and we would have to go through permitting and all of that. So you're seeing the idea here, sort of a section perspective drawing, the logs coming from the forest, and then what is the covering is the CLT roof. So it's actually I guess it is a 5x CLT roof. And so then we, 1 minute, I'm almost done. means they grow it, they harvest it, they replant it, but they actually use it as a money generation for their school and for their work. So the students scanned an area of the forest, and this image is one of those point cloud scans within the forest. And we began, these are as well, we began to look at these images and walk through the forest with Scott Sager, who's the forester and the assistant director of the school. We began to identify those trees that we could cut down, that we felt like they had the right sizes and diameters. Again, we wanted a range. We knew that we were going to have 27 columns. Some of them would be structural, others would not. And we began to dissect the part of the trees and understand exactly how would we cut and how would we deploy them within the building. And then what was really interesting on the left you're seeing is, again, working with a structural engineer, we said, hey, you get 6 columns to be structural, the rest are going to be aesthetic. They said we need 12. We ended up with 8, just so you guys know it's always a negotiation. So we had to have someone come out and visually grade these logs and say, yes, they were going to meet the structural parameters that the engineer had designed for, because again, they came right out of the forest, there was no manufacturing, and then they were going to be held up. So on the left, you're seeing us, we labeled the logs, and then if you look real close in the middle picture, I'm sorry, I don't have a laser, but the guy actually had like an old school just metal stamp, and he came by and just stamped the ones that said, yes, this means structure. So it was just how much did the grade turn over a couple feet in growing. If it twisted too much, it wouldn't be structural. Anything that was less than 4 inches in diameter wasn't structural. So it was really interesting to see him and to work with him to do that. And then what you see on the right is us, working out in the forest. I can't take credit for all this. Chris built a jig, and we worked with Rodolphe, which are mass timber fasteners and connectors. And some of the parts were custom made with a local steel guy. Others were those Rodolphe connectors. But you can see here us drilling out the log and then putting the connector in the base on the right side. And then here on the left, you can see install day. So we installed this over 2 days. At the base, you can see that those are ground anchors. Those are just steel ground anchors, about 4 foot in length. And you literally just had this machine that you augured into the ground. Again, we chose to have like 27 columns, so it took longer than one might do if you built it with 8 columns, but it was relatively pretty easy. We surveyed it, laid it out level, and then began to install the base of the logs, got a certain number in place, and then lifted each of the CLT panels in place. So you can see our team there. Then the picture on the right is being within the pavilion looking up. The holes are grids, remnants of where the trees would have been that were displaced or misplaced. And this is just an image. I apologize, there's no professional photography, but that's a snippet, so thank you.
Very interesting, and something I feel really connected to. I'm happy that you invited me to this group to talk about my work. I don't have any really overarching ideas really to present. You're going to see a lot of hand drawings. I guess the one premise that I could put forward is that I feel architects, and since I'm speaking mostly to architecture students, architects work with the aggregate of the natural world. Everything that you build comes from the natural world. It gets reformed, it gets milled, it gets put into different shapes, you build with it, and then nature tries to kind of take it apart through weathering. So there's this kind of philosophic relationship between the landscape and architecture that's inherent. So when you're looking at a building, you're looking at nature reformed, so to speak, or at least that's my premise. Because of that, I felt like being in a place particularly like this, the American tropics, we're so much surrounded by such a wonderful variety of plant material, of the landscape that is in some ways more present than the architecture. I think we can often see around us that if you stripped away a lot of the architecture, you probably have a more beautiful environment to live in, or that the landscape makes the architecture tolerable in some cases. Anyway, being here, I've come in contact with lots of interesting people. One of them connects to this drawing that you're looking at, a project that happened because I was given a baobab seed. That's what you're looking at. A horticulturalist from the Campon by the name of Crafton Clift gave me this seed when I went to visit the Campon. I think it was after Hurricane Andrew. And I decided to make a project based on it. So the project was to design a table for botanical illustration that you could carry into the field. So it's a field table for the study of the landscape. And this drawing, for me, was a very important drawing. It's probably what I would say is probably maybe my best drawing. It's pencil on vellum, red pencil, regular pencil. The drawing of the baobab seed is actually drawn to full scale, and the size of the sheet is about 18 inches square, which is the exact same size as the top of the table. So the drawing is an artifact that's scaled to the actual table, and it illustrates its function by having the botanical seed drawn as a study, in essence, on top of the surface of the table. It was built with some friends. A guy who makes motorcycles made the legs. A friend of mine made the top. A lab made the inkwell, blown glass that sits in a gimbal. So the table is designed to basically come apart. The legs fold up, become the frame for the backpack. The whole thing goes in or around the backpack, and you carry it on your back. And so you can collect seeds. It holds drawing paper, it holds pencils and pens, ink, and it won an award for furniture design in ID magazine some time ago. At the end of the day, it's too heavy to carry. I think if I were to do it all over again, I'd completely redesign it. So, as I said, the landscape is such an amazing thing that I've just really fallen in love with documenting it. I feel like we pass by it and through it every day, but we really don't look at it carefully. And unlike taking a photograph, when you draw it by hand and you spend a few hours or weeks, or in some cases I've spent months on a drawing, you get a different connection to it. So in these two drawings, on the right is a cannonball seed, and the flower, it's called 5 o'clock because the lizard's tail on the seed is at 5 o'clock. But more importantly, the 5 o'clock is a reference to the idea of time and change that the landscape always proposes, that when you study the landscape, you're always aware that things are changing more rapidly than architecture. And I found that to be quite an interesting thing. The Cuban belly palm is kind of hard to see, you have to zoom in, but the fronds really comb the sky, and I really thought of what was interesting about this tree. The trunk is covered with needles. The fronds are very, when they blow in the wind, you feel like the canopy is really combing the sky. But the reason it's drawn like this is I was trying to develop a technique for representation that students could use. So if you look at the border of the drawing of the tree, the palm tree, it's scaled. So if you count those different scales, you can find out what the canopy width is, the height of the tree, the diameter of the trunk. It's kind of symbolically drawn with a bluish background to suggest that it grows well in full sun. And the idea is that I would document the landscape in a way that architecture had been documented so that students could use these drawings in their designs of their landscape. So this is an example of two trees. The strangler fig, which is a native tree, Ficus aurea, and a sable palm. The sable palm is the host tree. The strangler fig starts as an epiphytic plant that lands in the top of the canopy, sends down roots, it becomes terrestrial, eventually strangles the tree and kills it. And so this is an example of one tree occupying the site of another tree over time. And the detail is also another layer of documentation. If you look at the drawing on the right, you can see that the foreground trunk is actually in the background drawing of the tree. It's the same detail, it's just pulled forward so you can study its texture, its color, and so on. With these drawings, I was also trying to begin to document things like the type of shade the tree creates and so on. So shadows, color, height, width, trunk size, all of these things become important. As I began documenting them, I got interested also in things like exotic invasives. This is a Melaleuca tree, and I started to think about how the landscape changes with invasives. People just tend to think about them as impacting the landscape in terms of crowding out natives, but they can also do things like change your view of the landscape. So this is an allegory. It was meant to be a kind of diptych to show that in the Everglades, what starts to disappear is your contact with the horizon, because these trees grow in such profundity and so densely that it changes your view of the landscape. So there's a process now of obviously removing them. They inject them with poison. It kills the tree. You can't burn it, because if you burn it, it sends the seeds into the sky, which helps it propagate in other areas. And ironically, it was started by a forester, John Gifford, connected to our Gifford Arboretum. He used to be faculty here and in Miami. Okay, so I'm going to skip quickly through since I only have 1 minute. That drawing evolved into this. This was a counter proposal for how to restore sheet flow in the Everglades. So cutting out all the Melaleuca, mixing it with plastic and aluminum and other garbage, you could form these boards, this boardwalk, that could be put out into the Everglades, an elevated boardwalk to overlook and look at the Everglades, but it also becomes a toll road, so you pay to cross a small bridge in between the center of the circle, and that is going to help pay for removing the levee, which is blocking the sheet flow of water in the Everglades, and help with restoring sheet flow through the Everglades. The picture on the bottom is a long story, I won't get into it, but M.O. Overstreet was a former senator. He was somebody who cut down cypress trees by the ton to make them for orange crates. Eventually, later on in life, decided he had done enough damage. He decided to preserve the small stand of cypress trees in Longwood, Florida, and they named it after him, and it's called the Senator, and it's like a 2,000-year-old tree that is in Longwood. It's something to go see if you ever think about it. Anyway, this expanded into larger urban projects like the Redland Plan, a preservation and tourism plan for an area of South Bay that's agricultural, a long project that did have an impact on preserving historic buildings and landscapes, well published. The drawing in here at the bottom is kind of in pieces and not correctly oriented. It was published in a German magazine, Stadtwaldwelt. But it was instrumental in showing people why this place is important. The relationship between the architecture and the landscape was significant. And this is Silver Palm Drive, just one street that runs east-west in that area. And the image on the right is one of the many case study proposals that the plan made for an agricultural district. You can see the existing conditions on the image on the square image on the left, on the right slide, and then the proposal to create an entry to the agriculture district because US 1 doesn't allow you to see that. Fennell's Orchid Jungle, a documentation project for the Historic American Landscape Survey done with students here at UM, is now becoming a project through the county. It was eventually sold. The Fennell family sold the site. Landscape, in this case, under Fennell, he produced cattleyas that were shipped to the north, New York in the 20s, and really was responsible for democratizing orchid culture in Florida in the early days. It was an attraction garden that was eventually sold to the county. Now is called Hattie Bower Preserve. The drawing on the bottom was made much later for an exhibition. It's 30 feet long by 4 feet wide. It's charcoal on bond. This is a detail. It's on the ground plane, so in the site. And the idea is to talk about how our understanding of the ground is disappearing. Here it is again. The drawing is designed in such a way that where light hits it, things come into focus, and where it's in shade, they disappear. And it talks about the types of light and the relationship between light and biotic growth. This is the last two images. A rather creepy view of Edward Leeds-Cullinen standing in his project, the Coral Castle in South Dade. Coral rock and oolitic rock doesn't carry on photosynthesis, but when it was below the water, it did house algae, it did create an environment for plant material. When it's brought above ground, it becomes a site for epiphytic plants and growth. And this is a documentation project I've been working on for the last 7 years for the owners of the site. I've produced hundreds of drawings. They're all by hand, the field notes, and also the plates are all by hand, and it'll eventually end up in the Historic American Landscape Survey of Washington. But I leave you with this last image just to say that, to remind ourselves that we are nature. So I find this really interesting. The image on the left is Leeds-Cullinen excavating these blocks of oolitic rock that weigh 3 to 4 tons apiece, sometimes as many as 20 tons. And on the right are two views of his interior, of his coral castle where he lived, the second floor of the castle. And if you look at it, you can see that the furniture, everything in the room is suspended off the floor. So there's a kind of interesting dialogue going on between him and his effort to free the stone from the ground, and then the way he actually lived suspended above the ground, at least for the time being. It kind of equates him with the material that he's working with. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodolphe, Shawna, and Rocco for presenting such interesting projects. So, in case you haven't noticed, we are slowly moving from the scale of the building component to the building to landscape, and what I'm going to share is kind of a project that perhaps has a more territorial scale. So this is longan, a fruit the size of an eyeball. Its name, longan, means dragon's eyes in Chinese. The longan tree is commonly found in tropical regions in Asia, but it has been commercially cultivated in South Florida since 1990s. This is one of the many tropical fruits grown in independent farms and home gardens in South Miami-Dade County. And the spaces and infrastructure that support cultivating tropical fruits are the focus of my presentation tonight. And this is actually an ongoing research project with my collaborator, Chishan. We began last July, supported by the school's Social Justice Prize. and also supported by our grad students, Shawna, Tu, and Caroline Alderson. They're also here in the audience tonight. The privilege of being at the University of Miami is that my research is also informed by the wealth of knowledge from various professors within the university, from the School of Architecture to the Department of English to the Engineering School. So some of you might remember this event that we did last semester, which includes talks about the infrastructure, legality, and Western knowledge involved in growing specialty tropical produce. The talk ended with a collaborative drawing exercise of the banyan tree just right outside by the lake. If you guys are interested, we can redo this drawing exercise together. So as Rocco have told you before, the urban development of South Florida is intricately connected to the agriculture. So our research is also informed by the book that he just shared about Redland. So the farming of what used to be called exotic produce is linked to the construction of tropicality and, by extension, tourism in this region of the United States. And of course, we cannot really talk about the concept of the tropical without talking about the circulation of people and plants around the globe. But shifting the time frame a little bit further to the second part of the 20th century, so our particular research focuses on a very small niche of tropical agriculture. It involves people from many different parts of Asia. They come to the United States for various reasons, this is to underscore that all these census categories, they're not monolithic, and the seeds and the plants that each culture brings to the United States also further the diversity of plant life here. But what is particularly intriguing for us is that the independent farms and home gardens in South Florida, they're actually part of a larger network of decentralized grower, wholesalers, and retailers in various Chinatowns on the East Coast of the United States. So for example, in New York, many of the produce that you find in supermarkets, they actually go through a centralized distribution system in the Bronx before they truck to other grocery stores in the city. But because the Chinese businesses, they have been historically excluded in the 19th and early 20th century, an alternative system was established that is not exclusive to people of the same ethnicity, but it also provides an alternative system that bypasses the centralized food distribution system. So it focuses on vegetables and fruit used in many different cuisines, from East Asia cuisine to Southeast Asia to Indian cuisine, but also currently to a certain extent also to Latin and South American produce as well. So now we are slowly moving to closer to where we are. So our research focuses on Redland, basically an agricultural area directly south of us. Our methods include site visits, walking interviews, archival research, media analyses, and also mapping. And we are thinking that as architects, one of the things that we can do in addition to designing buildings is also to gather information and try to represent information or data from various disciplines in a coherent manner. Part of what we are trying to map, this is still a work in progress, is the particular environmental condition, the unique environmental condition of South Miami-Dade County, but also the infrastructure that enables commercial farmers to be located in Redland. What you are seeing here in the photos of three of the bigger farms run by people that focuses on the Chinatown Food Network, and they uses brokers and wholesalers to further distribute their produce from Redland to different parts of different cities on the East Coast. Now just I wanted to zoom into one of the farms just to talk through different spaces and different methods of cultivation in one of them. So what you're seeing here is a farm run by 3 generations of Vietnamese people, and included on the site are their house. They actually also live on the site. They have a farm basically within the same property in their backyard, and they cultivate vegetables that they eat, but also other fruits that they would sell to wholesalers. In addition to that, within the farm, there are also a cold storage room where they store some of their produce, and also they pack their produce on site as well. Sometimes some farmers, they would just sell their produce for a packer or the wholesaler and have the packing done off site. But here, this is one of the larger commercial farms here, so they did everything on site. And there are currently, including the workers, they hired about 6 people living on the site full time. I think the last thing that I wanted to tell you is the trajectory of this research. So it started only about 7 months ago, but what we are also trying to analyze are also all these other cultural and religious spaces that are emerging in Redland because of the proliferation of all these farms. These are some examples of Thai and Vietnamese temples in Redland, and we are hoping that as we further develop this research, we not only draw and map out what we find, but also we will find a way to further engage the community over there, either through hosting events or further promote their businesses. So I'm going to stop here, and I invite Rocco, Rodolphe, and Shawna to join me on the stage for a conversation. Thank you. Thank you again for all of your presentations. So I think maybe I will start by asking a fairly obvious question. So I really appreciate the range of work presented tonight among all of us, not only in terms of scale, but also that the technology involved, as well as the type of representations involved and the ways to analyze and research different components of plants and also or forests or different regions. So my first question that I wanted to talk with you guys is about representation, the roles of drawing. So what we have seen so far in these 4 presentations are different ways of representing plants, either through scanning a forest or through hand drawing with a scale, or through kind of a phenomenal experience, sort of using different media to recreate the experience of, let's say, standing in a tree, for example. So I wanted to ask you more precisely, actually unlike buildings, which we all learn how to draw in architecture school, that is fairly static, but drawing and representing plants pose a question because plants, they grow, or forests, it changes over time. So as an architect, how would you approach the problem of representing something that changes either seasonally or throughout years, and also for annuals or biennials or other plants that flowers and seeds, at what stage would you represent, or at what stage would you pick to draw those plants?
Hello, can you hear me? I guess since I'm the one who still draws by hand and probably spends, and only because I can't draw on the computer, not because it's a choice, but the question's an interesting one in representing landscape. I tend to think of it more as a problem of trying to accurately represent things that are not currently available. There are most books that are for horticultural botanical study are plant identification books, where they take the plant or the element apart in such a way that is really just about trying to identify it. And they're oftentimes not very good in a sense that they give you a detail, or they don't give you the whole picture, or they give you the whole picture but it doesn't give you enough information to really study it. So it's really, for me, it was really about finding another way to think about representing things that is probably more part of the tradition of, Audubon and others like that, than it is about more contemporary representations. But as I said before, I was trying to draw for students, thinking that this was about helping students figure out a way to draw these things for use in architecture.
I appreciate the question on representation and the different response. Due to the abbreviated presentation, I didn't go into sort of all of the process ideas and engaging with material that we normally do. But for us, I think the representation when we're talking about building or making with wood is understanding what from forest to form means, and really getting our students and whoever we're talking to in the audience to care about material sourcing. What does it mean for a forest to grow? How do you manage it? How do you, what are the log it, mill it? How does it become dimensional lumber? What are byproducts? So like representing that whole cycle is, I think, maybe a different spin on your question to representation. But I feel, especially when we are talking about wood and building with wood, that we have a responsibility within our profession to understand that whole sort of system and network. And so for us, I think, however you do it, and it's interesting because last semester I taught a research studio and some students, drew or visualized that whole process through a series, like automated it. We have, we also take students to engage in the mills processes, so then they can sort of represent it in their mind. So anyways, I think that's a great question, and for us it's like representing a process of a material so that they own the knowledge, and they can't deny sort of that part of it.
In general, and not only with regard to plants and their living or dynamic nature and how you have to capture this, but projects nowadays that have an environmental dimension, that they are embedded in ecological processes, then I think our responsibility beyond describing the artifact is to also show the invisible forces, or consequences of these artifacts. So diagrams become extremely important, animations, videos, new forms of representation that capture the object in its complex context and how it may change it through those environmental aspect.
Could I add one thing? The drawings have a propaganda value too. I mean, they're to instruct. They have many different uses and audiences. With the Redland drawing, that long drawing, I only showed a piece of it. That was done by the students, kind of like a quilt. We had to make a desk because it was 121 inches long. And they each worked on different sections of it, and it came together as one drawing in the end. But the propaganda aspect of that drawing was so important and so significant because people couldn't get their mind around what was Redland. And so it was the one drawing that sort of put together the architecture and the agricultural landscape in such a way that people could see it and understand what they were fighting to preserve and fighting to try to develop a whole system of legislation that would preserve agriculture in that area. That drawing traveled all over Europe. It's probably exhibited maybe 20 or 30 times across the state. It traveled so much it never came back, unfortunately. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere in the ether. I think the last place was in Italy, in Bologna is where it landed and never came back. But it was a significant drawing in that regard, that it's outside your cone of vision, it's so big, it's so long, it's kind of like the thing itself. And that's one thing that Vincent Scully wrote about actually in Between Two Towers. And so I think it's important to think about what the system of representation when you're thinking about landscape. And these drawings that were shown today by Rudy and Shawna, I think, talk about a lot of those systems and how important it is to understand that the landscape and plants are a kind of system that's connected to lots of things.
I also want to follow up on that thoughts and ask more about the aesthetics of those representations that you chose. Really, in your project, the aesthetics, it speaks about technology in a lot of the representation versus Rocco. There was this, I think you mentioned it's kind of within the tradition of botanical illustration, but versus Shawna, your audience might be contractors or builders, so that's also has another, not only aesthetics, but also maybe another purpose for those representation. So I wanted to ask you how do you make a decision in terms of exactly how to represent those projects?
I can start. I'll give you maybe another answer, but slightly through a different one. So it's interesting, though, that the Mass Haptic project that we shared, representing it was also, that was a project meant to be inhabited as a living learning lab, meant to educate stakeholders just by visiting it, understanding the forest as a resource, understanding how it influences economies, environment, all of those items. But it was also what we used as part of the submission for the Venice Biennale. And then when accepted, you were given another prompt that said, okay, now interpret your submission and build basically this 2 foot by 3 foot, let's call it an object because it's our model that fits into a window. So it was really interesting for us to reflect on what is the essence of, that built artifact that's inhabitable, but how do we represent it in a completely different scale, and when we're trying to tell the story of it when someone's going to be experiencing it, in a completely different place. And then also, I think for us, it's also about understanding what is an American language of building or an American language of craft, and how does that material resource influence, making and maybe what are relationships of American craft to other cultures' crafts, when it comes to wood and Japanese or whatever, the story may be that we're trying to tell. So I think for us it was really interesting to interpret that and say, okay, now how are we going to, part of the pavilion was about using the actual logs, charring them, having people touch and feel and get dirty moving through that space, and then building a model that, took maybe dimensional lumber, CNC milled it, reinterpreted its form and scale, and then sort of through different analog and digital craft, going from sort of a less refined to a more refined exhibit piece. So I don't know. I guess our audience is always changing, and it's forcing us to rethink both the methods of making and the methods of communicating.
I think it's an interesting question, because one may wonder, why is Lily focusing so much on representation and aesthetics? We're talking about carbon footprints and what architecture can do, etc. But I think Rocco already answers this part with his notion of the propaganda. And this came up with the last lecture with Mark Tsurumaki, because this often comes up, this challenge, because he shows you like graphs about the carbon footprint of the architecture and why this work that he's doing is important. But finally, he is operating in such a rarefied, sphere, doing high-end single-family homes, etc. And then you wonder, how is he solving those challenges? But I think architects, we can solve these challenges. What we can do is produce those very compelling images that encapsulate, capture something about the challenge and can communicate ideas to the public and raise awareness about these issues. This is why I think it's critical, this notion of the aesthetics of sustainability in architecture. We're not solving problems of sustainability, we are actually developing a language for sustainability. This is why I completely buy this, what you just said about the power for propaganda by means of architecture.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you might look at some of these drawings, even the botanical drawings, and go, wow, what's the point, really? But you can say that you need to convince people that sometimes that things are precious. And if you see a photograph, it sometimes, David Hockney said this once very eloquently. He said, somebody asked him a question, I think it was, why don't we produce any more Rembrandts today than, people live longer, than they did in the Renaissance, and, why is it that we don't produce people that can produce the kind of images that were produced at that time? And he said something about, how we spend our time. Obviously our time is, filled with lots of other things. But he said time in an image is something that's valuable. And when he started doing the photographs, I don't know if you know the work of David Hockney, but he experimented with photography a lot. And he did these huge mosaics of what he called joiner photographs, where he would take Polaroids, let's say, of a figure, and he would take multiple shots of one figure and then assemble them like a mosaic into one image. And he was just trying to make the point that what's more valuable is reading the amount of time that you see in the image, and that there's some value to that. And he feels in some ways that image, that layer of time that you can contain an image is important. And the last thing I would say about the Redland drawing, that long drawing, it's those houses that are shown in there. Each of those houses were measured as a measured drawing and plan section and elevation by the student as a plate. And this was done after Hurricane Andrew. A lot of those buildings were damaged, and they gave the drawings to the owners, and the owners were able to use those drawings to apply for grants from the same grant that we got to do the plan to restore the buildings. So those drawings had a real practical use. They actually helped the owners get funds to restore the buildings. They then found their way into the long drawing. And so the drawings were useful. They weren't just beautiful images. They had a political dimension to them, the propaganda dimension, and a very practical dimension in terms of rebuilding the community. And so I think as architects, one of the things that we do, this has been said by people like Jorge Silvetti, is that we draw. And it's the difference between what we do and a lot of other disciplines do, perhaps, is that ability to visualize and ideas and put those thoughts into images for the good of the community, not just for practical purposes for individual profit, but to help others accomplish things. And so the landscape is such an important part of that message. I mean, I just feel like, and we need to do more with that.
Also, each of your presentation addresses different relationships between architecture and better to life. For example, Shawna, you're looking at better to life as building material. Rocco, you're looking at landscape. I like what you said about, you think about the building more like an aggregate or like a temporary collection of plant material. And Rudy, you look at plants or living organisms as embedded within the building system or building components. So I'm also wondering if Rudy, you brought up maybe the ecological crises that we are facing. So if part of the reason or part of the roots of the problem is that we don't necessarily appreciate or engage with ecology or other co-inhabitants of the world enough. There's this nature and culture divide. Then your projects, all of your work, make me also think about how would architecture, in the broader sense, help the general audience to maybe engage or inhabit an ecosystem or inhabit a landscape, a site, in a different way that would be more ethical or respectful to ecologies.
This is a question for you.
Okay. I mean, given our current status in life, I have a very apolitical answer where, and we reflected on this before we are where we are at today, but when thinking about trees as a building material, one of the first things that you always hear is, oh, I thought it was bad to cut down trees. you're harming the environment. And there are, of course, many conversations that can be had between foresters or biologists and thinking about monocultures and are we losing diversity, but actually in terms of Florida and how we manage our forests and how they actually are leading experts in burning and forest management, and that includes understanding, water as a resource and limiting the amount that's needed. That includes providing habitat for, biodiversity within these, managed forests, right? So there's tons of benefits on both sides, but one of the huge benefits is creating a demand for forests, right? So the more that we use wood and wood fiber, the more trees that we're growing. It's a known fact that trees, produce oxygen and capture carbon. Now, there's a longer story about offsetting that depending on how you manufacture it, how intensively are you managing your forest, how does it get from the forest to your building site. That has to be all part of the narrative. But in terms of how we approach it, it is apolitical because you can say, hey, you want to grow your economy, this is growing your economy, it's diversifying your economy to really build with the new building industry to create demand. We have mills closing in our state and the surrounding states while wood demand is increasing. So there are problems to be solved. There are many benefits to be had, and that's from my mind just went blank, but the money standpoint. But from an ecological standpoint, there's tons of benefits as well, right? And sitting next to experts, so I feel a little dumb, but just in having the symposium with the foresters and getting our architecture students around, foresters and biologists, even myself have learned, trees are kind of like humans, where in the first 10 years of life, they grow the most and really produce the most oxygen and capture the most carbon, and then growth begins to slow, and then there's other characteristics of that forest. So for all of these reasons, it makes sense to manage it and to, build with it. So I don't know, I have a great respect for the resource. I understand again that it has to be done thoughtfully. Right now we have some executive orders that have just said, go in and take everything out of the forest, that'll prevent forest fires. That's ridiculous. There are methods to everything, and we need to respect those practices. But we also need to ask hard questions, like what does it mean to be FSC certified versus SFI certified? And where are these certifications appropriate in what geographies? Different species of trees make sense to build with in different areas. So I could go on a lot longer, but I'll stop.
Yeah, but the question is also for you, Rudy. So in a way, the building components that you design also basically challenge us to rethink parts of the building system as this ever-growing, ever-changing mini landscape in a way, and you're kind of exposing also their life cycles, or you're requiring people who work in an office to take care of those mosses on the ceiling. So in a way, you're also establishing a different relationship between architecture, people, and the living organisms that the building components house.
Right, but I hope that it was evident, but there's always like a tongue-in-cheek quality. So it is, I don't think it's a kind of a naive, embrace of kind of ecology, but more about raising awareness, about how every building has ecological consequences. So when we restage ecological systems in a more didactic way through the building, then we actually, it's like a really a aspects of the environment and how architecture affects it. Right?
So you're also doing propaganda?
Yeah, maybe propaganda is not the right term, but it's a rhetorical project.
This discussion is reminding me too of a discussion I had some time ago about trying to define very specific limits and context and be very precise about how you're designing. And Nelson Goodman wrote this book called Ways of World Making to discuss the question about what is art. And he says, you're asking the wrong question. You should ask, when is art? Because art is really often about its context. You know, it's about, and Duchamp and others have just proven that point. But in terms of the landscape, what's interesting with climate change and so on, it's really a moving target. You know, we're seeing species move further north because of the change in temperature. Landscapes get changed kind of in tremendous ways that really affect how they interact. We had a discussion about the orchid jungle the other day because they want to turn it into a preserve that is open to the public, and the Department of Environmental Management is very, very particular about every little plant that's there, that, you know, how it might get infected by a dog walking through with spores in its fur that releases something into the landscape that then starts an exotic infestation. And I asked him, I said, look around outside here. I mean, this landscape was completely surrounded by slash pines for centuries, so much so that the early pioneers said the landscape there was dark when you walked through it. It was so dense with pine that it was dark. That landscape burned regularly, and because it burned, it kept the hammock into a very precise areas, because that's where there was water and there was hardwood species in one area. When they removed the pine limbs, the hammocks just kept growing. They keep extending out in all directions. So the landscape that we associate now here also, the lush tropical landscape, was really much, much smaller, much more confined to the edges, to hardwood. And it's changing because we've changed the ground plane, because of climate, because of the way we've handled the landscape and so on. So there's now lots of different attitudes about how we should move forward on that. But it's an interesting challenge, you know. It's a really a moving target, so we'll see what happens with all this.
I think right now is also maybe a good moment to see if any of you guys have further questions.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding redlands in Florida. How is the cultural heritage of redlands are being preserved and celebrated in this age of development, like this housing and all of this, the condominiums and other places like with being inhabited by people, like how you are preserving it. And also the second question about to Rocco, Professor Rocco CEO, about this Miami was many years ago a land of indigenous people. Miami was a huge tribe, which means also big water, big sea, and big water. And in building architecture, do you also celebrate or preserve the indigenous culture? How they were the first inhabitants, how they were building their living spaces, or designing and preserving the nature, living in harmony with nature. So do you also tap into indigenous knowledge?
It's a great question. There's lots of cultures, there's lots of histories to be studied and celebrated. In Redland, in that study in particular, one of the things that was even done before we did the Redland Plan was a study about what was called the finger prairies, the low areas that go from the Everglades to the bay, which were traditional paths for indigenous people, seasonal paths between the Everglades and the bay based on time of year. A lot of those areas were the places where they cut canals. So the canals are now occupying what was formerly a low area that had large areas of sheet flow of water traveling through there. You can even go, for instance, down, Rhode, and when you get close to where the old parajungle is, you'll see cypress trees along the road. That was an area that was part of that finger prairie that started in the Everglades and ends up in the bay. So Hattie Bower Preserve, which was the former orchid jungle, is one of the more important indigenous sites in South Dade. It has some of the oldest archaeological remains in North America, in the solution holes in particular. There's special places there that indigenous people use specifically because there were freshwater springs that came up from the ground through there. So that story I found out through an archaeologist named Bob Carr, who's done a lot of work all over South Florida. And he worked with us on the Redland Plan. In that, our plan is the documentation of those sites and suggestions about their preservation and celebration. The agriculture community is incredibly diverse. It's got everything you can imagine and every kind of agriculture that you can imagine. One of the things that was a challenge with the plan was there was two competing, so to speak, agricultural ideas down there. One was the row crop farmer, string beans, tomatoes, which had been there since the 1800s. And then there's the tropical fruit growers, the people that grow longanids, that grow lychees. They have a different view of the landscape, we found out when we were doing the study. The row crop farmers oftentimes were absentee landlords that would come in, have somebody farm the land. If they thought they could get a better price for it, they could plow under the row crops in a season, and then they could develop it for housing, incompatible housing oftentimes out there. The people that grew tropical fruits had more time invested in their land. It takes 20 years in some cases to grow trees of a certain size and a certain productivity, and you can also be more productive economically on a smaller parcel. You could make $200,000 a year selling lychees on 5 acres of land, comparably with a row crop farmer who would have to have 50 acres of land to make the same amount of money. And so oftentimes the people that were really interested in preserving agriculture were the people that were the tropical fruit growers and not the row crop farmers. It's not across the board, but that's what we found. And so there's a lot of competing interests. And through the research, you find that like Coral Gables, like Key Biscayne, like Miami Beach, most of those sites have indigenous origins. Eventually the land is sold, I don't know through what mechanism, it becomes agricultural, then it becomes an urban development and becomes a city. And so that tends to be the pattern. But what we found with Redland is there's that possibility of still preserving that story. But also, more importantly, that people are trying to stop the UDB, the urban development boundary, from going further west and wiping all that out. But they were trying to do it from the urban side and not from the landscape side. And from preserving agriculture was a way of preserving the Everglades, because you stop moving further west there, and also you stop the westward development of the city. And there's been many other urban designers who've also documented how much available land exists inside the UDB that's ready for development. You don't need to go further west. All of this was part of the discussion in the plan. There was proposals put forward, legislation that was passed and put into the Comprehensive Development Master Plan. Lots of different incentives for keeping it, like purchase of development rights, transfer development rights, and so on and so on. It's a complicated thing, and they're still working on it. It's just, if you know anything about the area, it's an ongoing battle. So, I don't know if that answered your question. The Dade County pine, Pinus ellioti, is the variety denta, is the scientific name. It went all the way to South Carolina. It's named after Stephen Elliott in the 1830s, who first found it. You know, a lot of the pine that exists is probably being thrown away, that was milled in the 50s, before the rock plow. It's in buildings that get torn down all the time, and it just ends up in a landfill. We need to do a better job of salvaging. We have a long history here in construction of salvage. All of the early buildings, like the Ransom Everglades Pagoda and so on, a lot of those buildings were built out of salvage materials from, in that time, wrecks off the coast. But there's a long history of salvage. Dade County pine, from biologists and horticulturists that I've talked to, they say that the real slow growth stuff happened because it was in undisturbed oolitic rock soil, and so it grew much slower. The cycles were really, really slow. And in the 40s, they invented the rock plow, and they plowed out a lot of, when they cut them all down, they also plowed out the oolitic rock in Redland for agriculture. So you don't have the same soil base that you had originally. But that doesn't mean you can't still grow it. And I personally have just recently planted a number of slash pines up further north of here. And I believe that everybody in their own property, just like you with your last slash pine, can plant endangered and threatened plants and make them come back. I mean, that's part of Dade County's plan recently for the new replanting of the whole county, the continuing the tree canopy program, and the Million Orchid campaign, and there's a lot of things going on, but I think one thing that we could, this is a crazy idea, but EEL, environmentally endangered lands, actually gives tax breaks to those parcels of land that are left that were originally undisturbed. So in Pinecrest, for instance, there's a development called Devonwood, and it has these 1 acre, half-acre home sites. People that live on a lot of those home sites have EEL land. They own, in essence, own the land that they live on, and they pay almost nothing for taxes. And so I think a plan should be to plant endangered and threatened plants and so on people's property, and then to see if they can become EEL designated lands and reduce your tax base because of it. So if you're doing the work of bringing back native trees and bringing back endangered plants, you should get some tax break for it. So this is a crazy idea, but maybe some others could take it up and maybe we could get it done.
Is there any precedent for this?
I don't know. That would be the first thing to find out, is whether there's precedent for doing this. Yes, that's a great question.
Well, one precedent, I mean, it's close, but not at all the same, is the tax breaks you get from renovating historic buildings.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
So, kind of take that idea to renovating the land.
Right. Exactly. We just have to write it up and propose it and see if we can get some legislators to back it.
Determine your period of significance.
Yeah.
That would be a discussion.
Just try it, see what happens.
Well, I mean, for instance, I have a very small little house in Coral Gables on a 50 by 100 foot lot, but I have probably the only lignin-inviting forest in that area. I have now 30-year-old mature lignin-inviting trees that have calipers that are, over a foot, and you won't find that anywhere else. And the site is full of it, but there's other people that have sites, I know, friends who've done that around South Miami and other areas. And the other thing is about connectivity, because here's another reason for doing that. Frank Chapman in the 20s did this incredible map that showed that all the migratory birds coming from South America every year, the peninsula of Florida is like a dock that sticks out into the ocean, and all the birds, they come from all over South America, and they get funneled over Colombia and Ecuador, and then they come over the ocean, over Cuba, and then they go right up through Florida, and then they spread back out again across North America. So migratory birds are really important in that whole picture, and if you don't provide the landscape for them, they don't have the food source to actually make the migration. And people like Edward Bach, if you've heard of Mountain Lake Sanctuary up in, where is it, Central Florida? It's a great story, but he built this Carillon Tower in the middle of an orange grove. The land is 360 feet above sea level. It's one of the highest points along the coast between here and Maine. And he built it as a bird sanctuary, a landing zone for migratory birds. Because he grew up on an island off Belgium where birds would die migrating because they couldn't make it to the next landmass and die on the ocean. So it's a great story, but anyway, that's a precedent, I guess. I think we probably kept him here long enough. It might be this.
Funny words.
Any other questions? Yeah, as you can see, we'll talk forever.
I'm going to close on, I think that no one would look at your drawings and say what's the value of that. It's imminent, they're beautiful. And I think there's a lot of nostalgia we feel to the landscape, and I think that's great. But I also feel like we're not going to be what we were in the past, and part of our role as a profession is to look around and say, what are the resources that are in front of us now, and how do we build communities and homes for people so that they maybe have the opportunity to then plant around their homes, right? But I think that we have to be okay with thinking differently about problem solving so that we can move forward, and then say, how do we bring some of these ideas about the rest of our environment, how do we think about them maybe together, right? Like, how does our landscape, our nature, the migratory patterns, how do we look around and understand that all of those things are connected and value landscape and architecture the same? But that's what I was thinking about when you were talking.